Hey everyone, welcome back to Bear It In Mind. This video is an exam paper walkthrough of the 2022 Paper 1 exam paper, specifically Section B, the memory topic. In the previous video I gave an overview of the paper with some general tips and advice for Paper 1, so do check that out if you haven't already done so. You'll find links to the exam paper and mark scheme in the description below, as well as links to videos on the parts of memory covered in these questions. Remember to pause the video and have a go at the questions yourself first, looking for the command words, topic and marks available before I walk you through it. In the memory section for this paper there are 3 short questions and a 60-mark essay with application. Question 5 says, briefly outline one way in which researchers have investigated the capacity of short-term memory. 2 marks. The command words are briefly outline, so we need to do more than just state or name information, but provide some elaboration. The topic is short-term memory and the focus is on capacity. The main way and most obvious way to answer this question is in relation to the multi-store model, and for that part of memory you need to know the coding, capacity and duration of the sensory register, short-term memory and long-term memory. Next, we need to notice that this question is focused on one way researchers have investigated capacity. So we need to describe a study that has investigated capacity. And importantly, the question is only asking about the way they studied, which means you do not need to write about the findings of the study. Often students waste time writing about the results of studies when the question doesn't ask for it. So this is why it's so important to annotate the question so that you carefully answer what it wants. If you've seen the videos on the multi-star model, you may remember this grid. So here we can see that one way of studying the capacity of short-term memory is through the digit span task. So you could write something like this. Participants are read a sequence of letters or numbers and asked to repeat the same sequence back immediately. An additional digit is added onto each following trial to measure the capacity of short-term memory. The word immediately there is very important because it's focused on short-term memory. The mark scheme was quite picky in making sure your answer made it clear that it was about short-term memory recall. Question 6 says, briefly outline one way in which researchers have investigated the duration of short-term memory. 2 marks. This question is the same as the previous question but with the focus on duration, so looking back at our grid again, we would see that one study into short-term memory was done by Peterson and Peterson in 1959. So we could write, participants are given a trigram, that's a 3-letter nonsense syllable, and then asked to count backwards from a certain number for a specified period of time. They are then asked to recall the original trigram. Question 7 says, a student showed participants a film of a car accident. After watching the film, each participant was asked to write down what they had seen. The student was surprised to see that the descriptions of the accident were quite different. The student's psychology teacher suggested that the participants' recall might be improved by using cognitive interview techniques. Suggest 2 cognitive interview techniques that could be used to improve participants' recall of the film. 4 marks. There are 4 parts to the cognitive interview, 5 if you count the enhanced cognitive interview, so here you need to pick 2 of them and relate them to the situation. So you could write about report everything and then apply that by giving an example of what that might look like in the scenario. For example, how the participants might report the colour of the cars, which might seem irrelevant, but this technique might trigger the recall of more information. Reverse the order. For example, from the point of impact to the start of the film, with the idea that this technique might disrupt the influence of schemas. Change perspective. For example, thinking about the accident from the point of view of the driver of one of the cars. Reinstate the context. For example, being reminded of the weather and the general environment, because this technique might trigger recall. Notice in the examples to this question that your application isn't directly in the scenario. You need to go beyond the scenario and use your imagination. As long as it fits with the scenario, then it's creditable. Question 8 says, Rory is talking with his grandparent and playing a game on his phone at the same time. The game involves matching blocks of the same colour to complete vertical and horizontal lines. It's only when his grandparent asks him to describe his route to school that Rory puts down his game so he can concentrate fully on his answer. discuss the working memory model, refer to Rory's behaviour in your answer, 16 marks. So this is a 16 mark essay with application. So the marks are divided up into 6 marks for AO1, 4 marks for AO2, which is the application, and 6 marks for AO3, your evaluation. So let's start with the big picture first. The question asks you to discuss the working memory model, and we could show that we know that the multi-star model was criticised for having an oversimplified and passive view of short-term memory, and Badley and Hitch in 1974 proposed the working memory model as a more active explanation of the different parts of short-term memory. For our AO1 marks, we would then describe each component, making sure to use key terminology. As a reminder, the working memory model looks like this, with its 4 different components. The central executive, the most important component because it's in control of the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad. It decides what we pay attention to and whether the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad does the working. The phonological loop. This is responsible for processing sound-based information. It's got 2 subcomponents. Firstly, the articulatory control process, the inner voice. It rehearses verbal sounds. And secondly, the phonological store, the inner ear. It receives and stores sounds. Then there's the visuospatial sketchpad, the inner eye, responsible for visual information, what we might see, what an object might look like, and spatial information, the location of objects in a space. It helps us know where things are in relation to one another. And finally, the episodic buffer, which acts as a backup store and integrates information from all the components of working memory as well as from long-term memory. Now, for our AO2 marks, we need to apply our knowledge of the components of the working memory model to Rory. This scenario is testing your understanding not only of how the working memory model is based on short-term memory and as such has a limited capacity, but also of dual task studies. Dual task studies are when you do 2 tasks at the same time. This could be 2 visual tasks, 2 verbal tasks, or 1 visual and 1 verbal task. In this scenario, we can see that Rory can talk to his grandparent and play the video game because he can divide his attention between a verbal task and a visual task. They are making use of 2 separate components, but he has to stop playing the game to describe his route to school because to do both visual tasks require the use of the visual spatial sketchpad. And because it has a limited capacity, he needs to give his attention to 1 of the tasks. Describing all of that would get you 4 marks of application. For the remaining 6 marks, we don't need to write as much as a typical 10-mark evaluation essay. So we could put some supporting evidence in, such as the case study of KF, who had a motorbike accident and subsequently had problems with his short-term memory. His visual short-term memory was pretty much normal, but his verbal short-term memory was significantly impaired, which suggests that we have separate components for visual and verbal memory. Or we could write about the research of Paul Esso et al., who provided evidence for the different parts of the phonological loop by putting participants in a PET scan. They found that when participants completed the task designed to activate the articulatory control process, the inner voice, a different area of the brain was activated compared to when they completed a task designed to activate the phonological store, the inner ear. We could then put forward some challenging research such as Wolbers et al. In 2011 with blind people and the visual spatial sketchpad, or as I'm going to put here, problems with the central executive. Despite it being the most important component that is in charge of the other parts, little seems to be known about the central executive. Its role in terms of attention and decision-making in working memory appears to be rather vague and largely untestable. And some psychologists have suggested that the central executive could also be divided up into separate parts. So here you can see for this essay, we've described the main features of the working memory model, broken down how that applies to the scenario we've been given in the question, and then provided some good discussion around the working memory model. So that completes section B. Links to videos on any of the parts of memory covered in this video can be found below. In the next video, we'll go through section C on attachment. I hope you found this video helpful, and we'll see you in the next one.